Hello everyone, my name is Sarah Cooper and I'm a researcher based in Cochrane, South Africa at the South African Medical Research Council. So my presentation I'm going to be giving today is on the topic of sampling in the context of a qualitative evidence synthesis, or QES for short. So in this very brief presentation, I'm going to give some background to sampling in the context of a QES. I'm going to touch on some of the reasons one might sample. Also, I'm going to point to various existing approaches for sampling for a QES. And then finally, also very briefly, look at the question of how much data or how many studies is enough or too much for a QES, which is a key kind of question when it comes to the topic of sampling. So one of the key characteristics of a systematic review, which in many ways separates it from, say, a narrative review or a typical kind of literature review, is the use of strictly exhaustive strategies to collect data and relevant studies. So this idea to work with kind of exhaustive or comprehensive samples is strongly informed by what Banut and colleagues talk about as the kind of risk of bias discourse. So this discourse really suggests that non-comprehensive samples may introduce a selection bias in a systematic review. But over the years, a growing number of QESs have been conducted, and with this, more and more researchers working on these kind of synthesis are questioning the logic of exhaustive samples for QESs. So in this regard, an alternative approach that is increasingly being proposed for QES is a more purposeful way of sampling for these kind of reviews. So what are some of the reasons for sampling in a QES? For those of you that have some background or are familiar with primary qualitative research methods, you'll see how many of the reasons for sampling in the context of a QES are very similar to why one would sample in the case of primary qualitative research. So first reason really relates to kind of pragmatic constraints. Research syntheses really demand a huge amount of time and resources, and also access to lots of information and often specialized expertise. And as Harsh Suri suggests, in many practical situations, this kind of highly rigorous approach is overly formalistic, too time-consuming, and unnecessarily expensive within the available resources and deadlines. So often QES authors are really confronted with the question of how to maximize the quality of the synthesis within the available resources. And here, purposeful sampling can offer a kind of potential solution for these constraints of time, resources, access to information, and so forth. Related to this issue, in contrast to effectiveness reviews or quantitative systematic reviews, including a large number of studies is not necessarily an advantage for a QES. Actually, too much data can undermine our ability to perform a thorough, in-depth analysis for a QES. And this is because qualitative research processes of analysis really require a detailed and in-depth engagement with the data. And this includes an engagement with findings, with the context, the epistemologies, the methods within and between studies. And so this can be very difficult to do with large volumes of data. Often when too much data is included in a QES, what results is really a sort of superficial findings that fail to go beyond a kind of descriptive level. So basically, an in-depth synthesis of purposefully selected studies is arguably more desirable than a more superficial synthesis of a large number of studies. Other reasons for sampling for a QES can be thought of as having a more kind of theoretical basis. So systematic reviews of effectiveness really aim to be exhaustive in order to achieve statistical generalizability. But the purpose of a QES most commonly is really not about seeking a kind of single correct answer. Rather, it's about understanding phenomena and exploring patterns and understanding complexities of different conceptualizations. So producing these kind of conceptual understandings really require variations in concepts and contexts and people, and this is really arguably more important than an exhaustive kind of inclusion of studies. I think the meaning and value of purposeful sampling is really nicely captured by this quote from Michael Patton, who's written extensively on sampling in the context of primary qualitative research. And I think it really equally applies to the context of QES. And what he says is the logic and power of purposeful sampling lie in selecting information-rich cases for study in depth. Information-rich cases are those from which one can learn a great deal about issues of central importance to the purpose of the inquiry. Thus, the term purposeful sampling. Studying information-rich cases yield insights and in-depth understanding rather than empirical generalizations. So what are some of the possible purposeful sampling approaches that can be used for a QES? So, although several qualitative researchers are recommending the use of purposeful sampling for a QES, it's still a relatively new methodological area. So there actually isn't a huge amount of discussion in the literature on how different strategies might be applied to a QES. And also more specifically, importantly, there's very little guidance on which sampling approaches are best suited to which kind of syntheses and synthesis questions. There are also very few well-described worked or practical examples in the literature on how researchers have actually gone about applying a sampling approach, the kind of nuts and bolts of what they did. And then also many researchers indicate in their review that they used a purposeful sampling approach, but they often really fail to properly describe what they did or create what is often referred to as a kind of transparent interpretive trail of their sampling processes. So this makes it very difficult to follow or understand how they sampled for their QES, and also to understand how their approach might then have impacted on their synthesis findings. That said, some guidance and examples is available, and hopefully we'll see more of these kind of examples emerging in the future. In your course notes, I've provided two worked examples of purposeful sampling. One is by Ames and colleagues in the context of a Cochrane review that was explored parents' perceptions of vaccination communication. And the other is a worked example by Benut and colleagues who described the sampling approach they took for their QES on sexual adjustment to a cancer trajectory. So these are two of the few practical examples that I know of in the context of a QES specifically, and I'd really like to discuss them in more detail during our contact session this week. So please do come with any thoughts and ideas and questions that you may have on these examples. Also, maybe if any of you know of other examples of sampling approaches that are in the literature, or maybe that you yourself have used for a QES, please do share these with us. I would be interested to see. Another useful resource to look at is Cochrane's Epoch's guidance on when to sample and how to develop a purposeful sampling frame, and I've provided the link here in the slide. This guidance is very much focused on QESs in the context of Cochrane reviews, but I think it's also potentially useful for non-Cochrane QESs and authors. The guidance particularly introduces one possible method for purposeful sampling and the kind of questions and ways of thinking that can be useful when thinking about sampling. Another very useful resource is Harsh Suri's theoretical article on purposeful sampling approaches for QES. And here Suri presents a range of different strategies that can be applied to QES. And these strategies are adapted from a list that was developed by Michael Patton for primary qualitative research purposes. And the principles are very much the same with regards to primary qualitative research. This table, which I took from one of your prescribed reading, Ames and colleagues from 2019, gives examples of some of these strategies. And these strategies range from extreme or deviant case sampling to maximum variation sampling, snowball or chain sampling, amongst many others. And your activity for the week, I've asked you to pick 3 of these sampling types, and for each type to develop a QES question or potential aim or purpose that might be amenable to the logic of that particular sampling strategy. So we can discuss this more at our contact session later this week. And also, I'd encourage you to go through these different strategies and bring any questions or points for discussion that you may have later on for our contact session. A final issue I'd like to discuss very briefly here is the question of how much is enough or too much. So as I've been describing, purposeful sampling is done to reduce the amount of data for analysis in a QES. So the obvious question that comes from this is how much is too much? So in other words, how many studies or how much data should one include in a QES? The answer to this question will very much vary across reviews and what their kind of associated aims and purpose and methods are. And at the end of the day, it's always inevitably a judgment. So I can't give kind of any rigid prescriptions, and it's clear when you look at different QESs, very different thresholds are used. So for example, I've seen QESs with a total of 4 studies included in the review, whereas others I've seen have over 100 studies included in the review. So there really is no fixed number or guidance that one can give of how many studies or how much data there should be in your analysis. But I think 2 concepts can be very helpful for thinking about this question of how much is enough or too much. So the first is the concept of data sufficiency. And this is really about what constitutes an adequate amount of evidence for achieving the synthesis purpose and for supporting the claims that are made. And here I think Patterson and colleagues provide the following principles, which I think can be very useful for asking about this question of data sufficiency. So they say that the data should be sufficient to permit comparisons among selected dimensions and constructs. They say the reports should reflect the work of several distinct and independent investigators. And finally, they say the data should be sufficient to answer the research question. So I think these are some quite useful questions one can ask regarding whether the data included in one's QES is sufficient or adequate. The second concept, which can be useful for thinking about how much is enough or too much, is the idea of data saturation. And this concept is used a lot in primary qualitative research. And like with primary qualitative research, data saturation in a QES would be at the point in the analysis at which inclusion of more evidence or more studies is likely to provide little or no new themes or insights, perspectives, or information. So this concept can be particularly useful if one takes a kind of iterative approach to sampling in a QES. So for example, an initial number of studies could be included in the analysis, and then others added until one reaches a kind of level of data saturation or where no new information is emerging. But I think this concept of data saturation for a QES requires a lot more thought and discussion and thinking for a QES. So that is the end of my formal presentation. Thank you everyone. Siyabonga, danki, inkosi. I hope this very brief presentation has provided some insights into the key issues around sampling for QES. And I really look forward to discussing this issue more during our contact session on Thursday. Thank you everyone, and goodbye.